Maria had been working as a housekeeper for the Ashford family for almost 3 years now. 3 years of waking up at 5 in the morning, making the long subway ride into Manhattan, and letting herself into the penthouse with her own key. 3 years of learning every corner of this place, every habit of the people who lived here, every sound the building made. She knew which floorboards creaked, which windows stuck when you tried to open them, and exactly how many steps it took to get from the kitchen to the master bedroom. The job was good, honestly, better than most she'd had. The pay was steady, the work was straightforward, and the Ashfords mostly left her alone to do her thing. Mr. Ashford Richard was always polite. He'd say good morning, ask how her family was doing, that kind of thing. Never rude, never made her feel small like some of the other rich people she'd worked for over the years. His wife, Victoria, was different. She was the kind of beautiful that made you look twice. Elegant. The way she moved through the apartment, the clothes she wore, the way she spoke, everything was calculated to impress. But there was something distant about her too, something Maria couldn't quite put her finger on. It was a Tuesday morning in late March when everything changed. The kind of morning where the sun came through the huge floor-to-ceiling windows at just the right angle, making everything in the penthouse look like it belonged in a magazine. Maria had her earbuds in, playing soft music while she vacuumed the hallway that led to the master suite. She was in her own world, just doing the work the way she always did, moving methodically from one end of the carpet to the other. That's when she heard it, a voice coming from behind the master bedroom door. A woman's voice, Victoria's voice, but something was different about it. The refined American accent was gone. Instead, Maria heard her speaking in quick, clipped syllables in a language Maria recognized as Russian. She'd heard Russian before, had worked in a home in Brooklyn years ago where the family spoke it all the time. Maria stopped vacuuming. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, didn't set out to poke her nose into things that weren't her business, but something about the tone of the conversation made her pause. Victoria sounded stressed, urgent. She wasn't having a casual chat with a friend. This was different. Maria pulled one earbud out. She could hear Victoria's voice more clearly now, though she couldn't understand the Russian words. But she didn't need to understand the words to understand the emotion behind them. Whoever was on the other end of that phone call, Victoria was talking to them like they had power over her, like she was answering to someone. There was a gap under the master bedroom door, maybe half an inch of space. Maria found herself moving closer, not deciding to do it, just letting her feet carry her there. She wasn't the kind of person who snooped. She'd always been raised to mind her business, to do her job and go home. But something about this felt wrong. Something in the way Victoria was speaking made Maria's instincts kick in. The same instincts that had kept her safe through a lot of years in a city that wasn't always kind to people like her. I know, Victoria was saying, her voice low but intense. But he can't find out yet. Not until everything is ready. Yes, I understand. The documents are already in motion. Maria's heart picked up a little. Documents. She wasn't trying to understand, wasn't trying to put the pieces together, but she was hearing things anyway. Dmitri, you need to be patient, Victoria continued. And now Maria heard something almost like pleading in her voice. 1 more month. Maybe 2. I have to do this carefully or it will all fall apart. The name hung in the air, Dmitri. Maria didn't know who that was. But she knew enough to know that Victoria wasn't supposed to be having secret phone calls with someone named Dmitri, talking about documents and keeping secrets from her husband. I told you, Victoria said, sharper now. He trusts me completely. That's exactly why this is going to work. Just give me time. Maria heard movement inside the bedroom, footsteps. She quickly stepped back, letting the vacuum cleaner fall into motion again, even though her hands were shaking a little. She pressed the earbuds back in, put her music back on, but she couldn't focus on it. Her mind was racing. She finished vacuuming the hallway, then moved on to the living room, then the guest bedrooms, all the while turning over what she'd heard. By the time Victoria emerged from the master bedroom about 40 minutes later, she looked put together and composed, like nothing unusual had happened. She was dressed for lunch somewhere, in a white linen dress and sunglasses that probably cost more than Maria made in a month. She said a polite hello to Maria, asked if she'd restock the kitchen, and then she was gone, out the door to wherever it was she spent her afternoons. Maria stood in the empty penthouse, the afternoon light streaming through those big windows. and tried to figure out what to do with what she'd heard. She was just the housekeeper. It wasn't her place to get involved in her employer's personal business. Plenty of marriages had secrets. Plenty of people had phone calls they didn't want other people to know about. That was just life. That was just how rich people worked, probably. But that voice, that urgent, stressed voice, and the way Victoria had said, "He can't find out," like it was something serious, like it was something that mattered. Maria finished her work that day and went home to her small apartment in Queens, where she lived with her sister and her sister's 2 kids. She didn't mention anything to them. She made dinner, helped her nephew with his homework, watched some television, and tried to put it out of her mind. It wasn't her business. It wasn't her problem. But when she went to bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She kept hearing that voice, kept seeing Victoria's composed face as she left the apartment, and she kept thinking about Mr. Ashford, about how he'd always been kind to her, how he'd given her this job when she needed it, how he'd treated her with respect when so many other people in his world wouldn't. By the next morning, Maria had made a decision. She wasn't going to do anything rash. She wasn't going to accuse anyone of anything or start any drama, but she was going to pay attention. She was going to notice things, and if something really serious was going on, if someone was really doing something wrong, well, then maybe she had a responsibility to do something about it. She didn't know it yet, but that decision was going to change everything. Not just for the Ashford family, but for her own life too, all because she'd overheard a phone call in a hallway and trusted her gut when something didn't feel right. The following Tuesday came around, and Maria found herself listening more carefully than usual. She paid attention to Victoria's comings and goings, noticed when she got phone calls, noted the times when she seemed stressed or distracted. She was careful about it, didn't want to be obvious. But she was watching now, and what she started to notice would eventually pull her into a world of secrets she never knew existed. The weeks that followed that first phone call were strange for Maria. She found herself becoming a different kind of observer in the penthouse, noticing things she probably would have missed before. It wasn't spying exactly, not in the way she thought of it. She was just doing her job, just being present in the space where she worked. But now she was paying attention to details, storing them away in her mind like she was building a puzzle and didn't yet know what picture would emerge. The first thing she noticed was that Victoria wasn't home as much as she used to be. Before, she'd been around most afternoons, usually doing something in the study or on her laptop in the living room. Now she was out constantly, gone for hours at a time, sometimes not returning until Richard was already home from the office. When Maria asked her about restocking certain items or whether she needed anything from the grocery store, Victoria would be vague. "Oh, I had lunch with friends," she'd say. Or, "I was at the spa." Simple explanations that didn't really explain anything. Then there were the phone calls. They kept happening. Sometimes when Victoria didn't know Maria was in the apartment, Maria would be cleaning the bathrooms or organizing the linen closet, and she'd hear that same rushed, urgent voice coming from one of the bedrooms or from the study, always in Russian, always the same intensity, the same sense of urgency. Maria still couldn't understand the words, but she was learning to recognize the emotional patterns. There was always that same person on the other end, the one Victoria kept calling Dmitri in hushed tones. One afternoon, maybe 2 weeks after that first conversation, Maria was dusting the living room when Victoria came home from wherever she'd been. She wasn't alone. There was a man with her, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and the kind of expensive clothes that told you he wasn't the plumber or the electrician. He looked out of place in the penthouse not because he wasn't rich, but because he had this edge to him. Like he didn't usually spend his time in spaces this refined and polished. "Thank you for coming," Victoria was saying as they entered the apartment. She looked around quickly, like she was checking to make sure they were alone. She didn't notice Maria right away, partially hidden behind the large sofa as she dusted one of the shelves. "We don't have much time. Richard could be home in a few hours." The man nodded. He had an accent when he spoke, the same Russian cadence that Maria heard in Victoria's voice during those phone calls. "The transfers are proceeding as planned," he said. "But we need to move faster. The window is closing." Maria's hand froze in the middle of dusting a picture frame. She kept her breathing steady, kept her movements small and controlled. She'd learned a long time ago how to make herself invisible when she needed to, how to be in a room without being noticed. I'm doing everything I can, Victoria said, and there was an edge of frustration in her voice now. You have to understand, I can't just move millions of dollars without raising questions. Richard reviews the statements. He's not stupid. No one said he was, the man replied, and now there was something cold in his tone. But we didn't hire you because you were incapable of handling this. We hired you because you said you could handle it. The conversation continued for maybe 10 more minutes. They talked about accounts and numbers and something called the Moscow operation. Maria caught fragments. References to documents that needed to be prepared. Talk about timing and patience. The man, who Victoria had called Dmitri when they were on the phone before, though she didn't say his name directly now, seemed to be the one giving instructions, and Victoria seemed to be the one taking them. Finally, they moved toward the study. The door closed behind them, but not before Maria had caught sight of Dmitri's face clearly. She committed it to memory the way she'd learned to do over years of life in the city. You learned to remember faces. You learned to notice things because sometimes noticing things kept you safe. She continued her dusting, her mind working overtime. This was real. This wasn't just overheard fragments or paranoid interpretation. There was an actual man, an actual presence, and an actual conversation about moving money and operations in Moscow. This was the kind of thing that could destroy a person's life if it got out. This was the kind of thing that could destroy Richard's life. Over the next few weeks, Maria found herself watching even more carefully. She started noticing small things, details that probably meant nothing on their own but added up when you put them together. There was a business card that fell out of Victoria's purse one day when she was taking off her coat. Maria found it while vacuuming near the entryway. It had a name on it, Dmitri Volkov, and a phone number. No company name, no title, just a name and a number. Maria took a picture of it with her phone, her hands shaking a little as she did. She didn't know why she was doing it exactly, but she knew she needed to remember this name, this face, this connection. She also started paying attention to the computer situation. Victoria had her own laptop, a sleek silver thing that she kept with her most of the time. But sometimes she'd be working on the family computer, the one in the study that Richard also used. Maria wasn't the kind of person to go through someone's private files. That felt like a line she wasn't willing to cross, but she couldn't help but notice when Victoria quickly closed windows or cleared the browser history whenever she heard footsteps. She couldn't help but see fragments of things. Bank websites, wiring instructions, references to accounts in places Maria had never heard of. One day, while Maria was cleaning the study, she found a piece of paper that had fallen behind the desk. It was a handwritten note in Victoria's careful handwriting. It said, "Transfer 2.3 million to Singapore account. Documents prepared. Ready for phase 2. Meeting with D scheduled for Thursday." Maria's breath caught in her throat. $2.3 million. That was real money. That was serious money. That was the kind of money that could ruin someone. That could destroy a family. She photographed that too, careful to put the note back exactly where she'd found it, even though every instinct was screaming at her to take action. But she wasn't ready yet. She didn't have the full picture. She didn't understand what was actually happening or why. She just knew that something was very wrong, and that the person she was working for was at the center of it. The strange thing was, the more Maria observed, the more confused she became about Victoria's motives. Because Victoria genuinely seemed to care about Richard, Maria would see them together sometimes, would hear Victoria ask about his day, would watch her hand him a drink the way someone does when they care about someone else's comfort. And then Maria would remember the phone calls, the secret meetings, the money disappearing into accounts that Richard knew nothing about. It didn't make sense. If Victoria hated Richard, if she was trying to destroy him, that would be one thing. But she didn't seem to hate him. She seemed to actually like him, maybe even love him, which somehow made it all worse. By the end of the 4th week, Maria had filled a small notebook with her observations, dates, times, descriptions of conversations. The business card with Dimitri's name, notes about the bank transfers and the Singapore account. She'd even started keeping track of when Victoria seemed most stressed or most happy, trying to figure out what triggered each emotion. She had a folder on her phone with pictures of the note she'd found. The business card, anything tangible that proved what was happening wasn't just her imagination or paranoia. She knew she was approaching some kind of decision point. She couldn't keep watching and doing nothing forever. Eventually something was going to happen. Something was going to break, and when it did, she was going to have to decide what side of it she was on. Was she going to protect her job, her paycheck, the comfortable situation she'd built? Or was she going to do what she increasingly felt was the right thing? Maria didn't have an answer yet, but she knew that answer was coming, and that once she made it, there would be no going back to the way things had been before. The penthouse would never feel the same. Her job would never feel the same. Everything would change. For now, though, she kept watching. She kept listening. She kept gathering information, because she had a feeling that when the moment came to act, she would need everything she'd learned to make the right decision. Maria lay awake in her bed on a Thursday night, staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom in Queens. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the city, the distant sirens and car horns that had become the background music of her life. Her sister was asleep in the next room. The kids were asleep down the hall. Everything was quiet and dark, and Maria's mind wouldn't shut off. She'd been carrying this secret for nearly 2 months now. 2 months of watching and listening and photographing evidence and writing things down in her notebook. 2 months of knowing something that could change everything and not knowing what to do about it. She'd gone back and forth on it 1,000 times. Tell him, don't tell him. It's not your business. It is your business. You'll lose your job. You'll lose your mind if you don't do something. The truth was, Maria had never been someone who could ignore a problem when she saw one. Growing up, she'd had to be the kind of person who noticed when things weren't right. She'd had to be the one who spoke up, who asked questions, who tried to fix things even when no one asked her to. It had gotten her in trouble before, but it had also saved her more times than she could count. She thought about Richard. She thought about how he'd been kind to her, how he'd trusted her enough to give her a key to his home, how he'd never made her feel like she was less than he was, even though they lived in completely different worlds. And she thought about how he was being played for a fool by the woman he'd married, the woman who was supposedly his partner in life. By Friday morning, Maria had made her decision. She'd gone over it in her head 100 times during a sleepless night, and she kept coming back to the same conclusion. She couldn't keep quiet. She couldn't go to work every day and watch him, knowing what she knew. That wasn't who she was. That wasn't the kind of person she wanted to be. The problem was figuring out how to tell him. She couldn't just blurt it out. She couldn't walk into the study and say, "Hey Richard, your wife is stealing from you and meeting with some Russian guy named Dmitri about offshore accounts." He wouldn't believe her. He'd think she was crazy or jealous or making up stories. Or worse, he'd think she was snooping on purpose, trying to start trouble. She needed to find a moment when they were alone, when it was just the two of them, when she could speak to him like she was speaking to another human being, instead of speaking to her boss. And she needed to figure out exactly what to say. The opportunity came on a Saturday afternoon. Richard had been working from home and Victoria had gone to the spa for her usual routine. She wouldn't be back for hours. Maria was organizing the kitchen, putting away groceries and doing the kind of work that was part of her regular routine. She could hear Richard in the study, on a work call, his voice calm and professional the way it always was. When he finished the call, he came out into the kitchen, loosening his tie and looking tired. He got himself a glass of water from the fancy dispenser they had installed, the kind that made water cold and filtered without having to use plastic bottles. That was the thing about working for rich people. Even the simple things were complicated and expensive. "Maria, you're here on Saturday?" he said, noticing her. "I thought you had weekends off most of the time." "I needed to pick up some extra hours," she said. Which was true. She could always use the extra money. But it was also an excuse to be here, to position herself to have this conversation. "Is that okay? I can leave early if you need me to." No, stay," he said. He sounded tired, distracted. "Honestly, the more time I spend away from everything, the better I feel lately." That opening, that tiny crack in his usual composed demeanor, was what Maria had been waiting for. She put down the groceries she was unpacking and turned to face him. She'd rehearsed this conversation in her mind so many times that the words came out more smoothly than she expected. "Mr. Ashford," she began, and her voice was steady even though her heart was racing. "Can I talk to you about something? As like one person to another? Not as the housekeeper to the boss, but just as two people?" He looked up from his water, surprised by her tone. There was something in his eyes that suggested he'd been waiting for someone to say something real to him. Something honest. "Of course," he said. What's going on? Maria took a breath. There was no going back now. I need to tell you something about Victoria, she said. And I need you to listen to me before you make any decisions about what I'm saying, okay? Because I know this is going to sound crazy, and I know this is going to be hard to hear, but I've been seeing and hearing things over the past couple of months, and I can't keep quiet about it anymore. Richard's expression changed immediately. The relaxed look was gone, replaced by something guarded. What kind of things? He asked, so she told him. She started with the phone call she'd overheard that first day. The conversation in Russian, the name Dmitri. She told him about the mysterious visitor, the man she'd seen with Victoria in the living room. She told him about the conversations she'd heard about documents and transfers in something called the Moscow operation, and she told him about the evidence. The business card with Dmitry Volkov's name and number, the handwritten note about the Singapore account and the $2.3 million. She pulled out her phone and showed him the pictures she'd taken. She watched his face as he looked at them, watched him go through the different stages of realization. Confusion, denial, anger, and underneath it all, something that looked like pain. You photographed these? He asked, his voice quiet. I did, Maria said, because I knew you wouldn't believe me if I didn't have something to show you. I know how this looks. I know it looks like I'm overstepping. I know I'm the employee here, not the family member, but I couldn't stay quiet. Richard sat down at the kitchen table, still holding Maria's phone, scrolling through the pictures again. Did you go through her computer? Go through her files? No, Maria said firmly. I didn't snoop through anything. I found that note because it fell on the floor. I took the picture of the business card because it was in her purse and the card fell out when she was taking off her coat. Everything I'm telling you. I either saw or heard or found by accident. I wasn't digging for it. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked, and why wait 2 months? Because I wanted to be sure, Maria said. And because I was scared. I was scared of losing my job. I was scared of being wrong. I was scared of making everything worse when I was just trying to make it better. But I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I'm sorry if I should have told you earlier, but I'm telling you now. Richard looked at her for a long moment. She could see him processing, could see him trying to figure out if she was telling him the truth, and then slowly she watched him believe her. Because deep down she suspected he already knew something was wrong. People always know when something isn't right with the person they love. They just don't want to admit it to themselves. I need to hire someone, he said finally. A private investigator. Someone who can look into this properly, legally, without us getting into trouble for it. I think that's a good idea, Maria said. And Maria, he added, looking directly at her, thank you. I know this took courage. I know this wasn't easy for you. I won't forget it. Maria nodded, but she didn't feel like there was much to thank her for. She'd just done what she felt was right. She'd told the truth. But now they both had to live with the consequences of that truth. And Maria had a feeling those consequences were going to be bigger and stranger than either of them could have imagined. She finished putting away the groceries in silence while Richard sat at the table, staring at nothing, his entire world shifting beneath him. The penthouse felt different now, heavier somehow. Like the air itself had changed, like they were standing in a space where something important had just broken. There was no going back now. Everything was going to change. The private investigator that Richard hired was a woman named Catherine. She was in her late 50s with sharp eyes and the kind of no-nonsense attitude that suggested she'd seen just about everything in her career. She came to the penthouse on a Monday evening, when Victoria was at a charity benefit and wouldn't be back until after midnight. Richard had already checked with her to make sure of her schedule. He needed her gone, needed her out of the apartment so that he could do what he had to do. Catherine brought equipment with her. Small cameras, listening devices, things that Maria didn't fully understand but knew were designed to capture evidence. She set up in the study with professional efficiency, asking Richard questions about Victoria's movements, her routines, which rooms she spent the most time in. Maria watched from the kitchen, pretending to clean, but really just trying to absorb what was happening. This was real now. This wasn't just suspicion and observation anymore. This was a full investigation, the kind that could end marriages and send people to prison. How sure are you? Catherine asked Richard, glancing at Maria briefly before returning her attention to him. Because I need to know if I'm looking for confirmation of something you already know, or if I'm looking for information you don't yet have. The approach is different, I'm sure enough, Richard said. He was sitting on the edge of his desk, his tie loosened, looking exhausted. My housekeeper has been very thorough. She's documented things. She has photographs. Catherine nodded, professional and efficient. I'm going to need access to your financial records, your bank statements, any accounts you share with your wife. I'm going to need the names and numbers she has in her contacts. I'm going to need to know everything you can tell me about this man, Dmitry Volkov. Over the next 2 weeks, things moved very quickly. Catherine installed the cameras and the recording devices. She began documenting Victoria's movements, her phone calls, her meetings. She pulled financial records and started tracing the money that had been disappearing from the accounts that Richard and Victoria shared. And piece by piece, a picture began to emerge. A picture that was far worse and far more complicated than what Maria had initially uncovered. Victoria wasn't just stealing money. She was part of something bigger, much bigger. The investigation revealed that she wasn't even Victoria Ashford at all. Her real name was Katerina Volkova, and she had assumed a completely false identity in order to infiltrate Richard's life and his business. She had been placed with him deliberately. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment deception. This was a coordinated operation. Dmitry Volkov wasn't her ex-husband. He was her handler, the man who had been giving her instructions all along. The money that was being transferred wasn't just disappearing into Victoria's pockets. It was being funneled into accounts connected to illegal operations happening in Moscow. The documents she'd been preparing were fraudulent financial instruments designed to launder money through Richard's legitimate businesses and international accounts. When Catherine presented this information to Richard, he went white. He sat in the study for hours without moving, just staring at nothing. Maria brought him coffee that he didn't drink, water that he didn't touch. She didn't know what to say to him. There were no words for something this big, this invasive, this devastating. She played me, Richard said finally, his voice hollow. For how long? How long have we been together? 5 years, Catherine said, consulting her notes. Based on the financial records and the trail of documentation, that's when her first transactions began to appear in your accounts. You got married 2 years after that. So she spent 3 years planning to marry me, Richard said. 3 years of lying to my face, pretending to be someone she wasn't, getting me to trust her, getting me to love her, all so she could steal from me. Maria felt something twist in her chest. She watched Richard come to terms with the fact that his entire relationship was built on a lie, that the woman he had married wasn't real, that everything he thought he knew about his own life was false. It was one of the saddest things she'd ever witnessed. But the shocking part came a few days later. Catherine came back to the apartment with federal agents. She had notified the FBI about what she'd found, about the international fraud operation, about the money being laundered through Richard's accounts. They had a warrant to search the apartment, to secure evidence, to prepare a case that was larger than any of them had initially realized. The agents went through the penthouse systematically. They took Victoria's laptop, her phone, her files. They looked at her closet and found designer clothes with Russian labels. They found cash hidden in a safe behind a painting. They found documents written in Russian that outlined the entire scheme in detail. Names of people involved, instructions about what to do with the money, references to operations in Moscow and connections to people who were wanted by multiple governments. Maria watched it all happen, and she felt a strange mixture of vindication and horror. She had been right to be suspicious. She had been right to pay attention. But she'd also been right to feel afraid, because what she'd uncovered was far darker and more dangerous than she could have anticipated. When they took Victoria into custody, it happened in the early morning. She came back to the apartment from wherever she'd spent the night, and the federal agents were waiting. Maria heard the commotion from the kitchen, heard Victoria's voice change when she realized what was happening. Gone was the refined American accent. Gone was the carefully constructed personality. In its place was anger and desperation and a voice that suddenly sounded like what she really was. A woman who had been caught. They read her rights to her. They put her in handcuffs. They led her out of the penthouse and into a waiting vehicle. The entire operation took maybe 15 minutes, and then she was gone. Richard stood in the living room afterward, watching from the windows as the cars pulled away. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 2 weeks. His face was thin, his eyes were hollow, everything about him seemed smaller somehow, diminished. "I want to thank you," he said to Maria. turning away from the window. Properly this time. Not just as an employer to an employee, but as a man who's been helped by another person. You saved me from losing everything. If this had continued for another few years, if she'd had more time to execute whatever plan she had, it could have been catastrophic. I did what I thought was right, Maria said quietly. I know you did, Richard replied, and that's what makes it so remarkable. You didn't have to. You risked your job, your reputation, your safety. You did it anyway because you thought it was the right thing to do. The media picked up the story pretty quickly after that. It was too big, too sensational not to. Federal agents, international fraud, fake identities, money laundering. The news outlets loved it. Headlines appeared all over the place. And through it all, Maria found herself at the center of attention in a way she never expected. People wanted to know who had uncovered the fraud. People wanted to talk to the housekeeper who had noticed something was wrong. Reporters called the penthouse. Producers from news programs reached out. There was a part of it that felt good, like her instincts and her courage were being validated. But there was another part that felt uncomfortable and invasive, like her private life and her personal experience were being turned into entertainment for strangers. Richard offered her a significant bonus, money she hadn't asked for and didn't expect. He also offered her something else. He offered her a chance to move into a different role. He was putting together a small consulting business focused on security and household management for high-net-worth individuals. He wanted her to be part of it, to use her skills and her instincts to help protect other people from situations like the one he'd just gone through. You have a gift, he told her. You notice things. You understand people. You have good judgment. That's valuable. That should be valued. Maria thought about it for a while. The idea of leaving the role of housekeeper, of becoming something more, of using her skills in a different way. It was terrifying and exciting at the same time. It was a change she hadn't planned for, but it was a change that suddenly felt possible because she'd trusted her gut and done the right thing, even when it was hard. The penthouse felt different now, too. It was still beautiful, still elegant, still filled with expensive things, but it felt emptier somehow, like something had left when Victoria had left. Richard moved through it like a ghost sometimes, going through the motions of his life while he figured out how to rebuild it from the ground up, without the woman he thought he'd married, with only the truth about who she really was. 6 months had passed since Victoria was taken away in that federal vehicle. 6 months of legal proceedings, media coverage, and the slow process of Richard trying to piece his life back together. The trial was ongoing, but the outcome was almost certain. The evidence was overwhelming. Victoria, or Katerina, or whoever she really was, had confessed to most of the charges. She was looking at a significant prison sentence. Maria stood in the office of a small but elegant consulting firm located in Midtown Manhattan. The sign on the door read, Ashford Security and Household Management. It was a Friday afternoon, and she was reviewing files for upcoming clients. All of them wealthy individuals who had heard about what had happened to Richard, and who wanted to make sure it didn't happen to them. It had been a strange transition, going from being a housekeeper to being a consultant. At first, Maria had almost turned down Richard's offer. It felt too big, too much of a leap. She was used to cleaning toilets and vacuuming carpets, not sitting in meetings with millionaires and advising them on security protocols. But Richard had been patient. He'd explained that her real skill wasn't in the cleaning, though she was good at that. Her real skill was in observation and understanding people, in noticing when something didn't add up, in trusting her instincts. You see things that other people miss, he'd told her. And more than that, you see the truth in people. You can tell when someone isn't who they say they are. That's not something you can learn in a classroom. That's something you either have or you don't. So she'd taken the job. It had meant learning new things, going to some training sessions, reading books about security and background checks and the kinds of warning signs to look for in people you hire or let into your life. It had meant stepping outside her comfort zone in ways that terrified her. But it had also meant something else. It had meant that what happened to Richard wouldn't happen to other people, at least not the people who hired her firm to help them. The first few weeks had been the hardest. Maria had felt like an imposter, like she was pretending to be something she wasn't. Clients would come in expecting someone polished and professional, and instead they'd get a woman who still had an accent that marked her as someone from outside the usual circles of wealth and power. Some of them had been skeptical at first. She could see it in their faces when they shook her hand, The slight hesitation, the quick assessment of whether she belonged in that room. But then she'd start talking. She'd share her story, not all the details, just enough that they understood what she'd seen and what she'd uncovered. She'd explain the signs she'd noticed, the small red flags that had added up to something massive. And she'd watch their skepticism transform into respect and interest, because they understood then that she wasn't just another person working in the security industry. She had lived through this. She had seen it from the inside. Today, a new client was coming in, a woman named Constance, who had recently married a man she'd met while traveling in Europe. The marriage had happened quickly, and now Constance was having doubts. Something about her new husband didn't feel right. She couldn't articulate exactly what it was, but she'd heard about Maria's story and wanted to talk to her about whether she should be worried. Maria had been in Constance's position before. She knew what it felt like to have that nagging sense that something was off but not being able to prove it. So she'd agreed to meet with her, to listen to what she had to say, and to give her honest advice about what signs to look for and what steps she could take to protect herself. When Constance arrived, she was nervous. Maria could see it in the way she held herself, the way her hands moved when she talked. Maria had learned to read people like that. Years of working in homes, of being invisible while observing, had given her a kind of radar for emotional states and intentions. "I feel like I'm being paranoid," Constance said, sitting across from Maria in the small office. "But after I heard your story, I couldn't stop thinking about whether something similar could be happening to me." "Tell me," Maria said simply. "Tell me everything." So Constance talked. She talked about how her husband had moved very quickly to get her to marry him, about how he seemed more interested in her money than in her personally, about how she'd caught him on the phone speaking in a different language when he thought she was asleep, about how some of her jewelry had gone missing. As Maria listened, she heard echoes of what had happened to Richard. Not exactly the same, but similar. The same pattern of someone getting close too fast. The same subtle signs that something wasn't quite right. Maria asked questions, probing gently, helping Constance articulate the fears she'd been unable to put into words. "I think you should hire a private investigator," Maria said finally. "I can recommend someone. And in the meantime, I'd suggest having conversations with your lawyer about protecting your assets. Don't confront him about your suspicions. Just get information, get help, and then make decisions based on what you learn." Constance left the office looking more calm than when she'd arrived. Not because Maria had told her everything would be fine, but because she'd validated her concerns and given her a path forward. This was what Maria's work had become. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. She was helping people protect themselves. She was using what she'd learned from the hardest experience of her life to prevent other people from going through something similar. That evening, Maria went to meet Richard for dinner. It had become a kind of tradition between them, a monthly check-in where they could talk about work and life and how they were both doing. Richard had recovered much better than Maria had expected. He'd thrown himself into building the consulting business, into creating something meaningful from the wreckage of his failed marriage. He'd also been very good about one thing. He'd never blamed Maria for what Victoria had done. If anything, he'd become protective of her, making sure that when media outlets wanted to cover her story, they approached it respectfully and fairly. "How was Constance?" he asked as they sat down at a quiet restaurant that had become their usual spot. "Worried, but getting better," Maria said. "I think we'll help her figure out what's really going on with her husband." Richard nodded. "You're good at this," he said. "Better than I ever expected you'd be. You know that, right?" "I'm still figuring it out," Maria admitted. "Some days I feel like I belong here, and some days I feel like I'm faking it." "That's normal," Richard said. "I feel that way about a lot of things. But here's what I know. You have something that money can't buy. You have integrity. You have the ability to see through bullshit and tell the truth even when it's hard. That's rare. That's valuable," Maria smiled. A year ago, she never would have imagined this. A year ago, she was just the housekeeper, trying to stay invisible, trying to do her job and go home. Now she was a consultant, helping wealthy people navigate the complicated and sometimes dangerous world of trust and deception. The strangest part was that it had all started because she'd noticed something was wrong. Because she'd trusted her gut. Because she'd been brave enough to speak up, even though it was scary. And now on the other side of it all, that courage was becoming something more. It was becoming a career. It was becoming a way to make a difference. 3 years later, Ashford Security and Household Management had become one of the most trusted consulting firms in Manhattan. Maria had helped uncover 3 other fraud schemes involving people who had infiltrated wealthy families under false identities. She'd trained a small team of investigators, many of them women like herself who had come from outside the usual circles of power and privilege. She'd written a book about her experience, about the warning signs to look for, about how to trust your instincts even when the world around you is telling you that everything is fine. She'd moved out of Queens and into a nice apartment in Manhattan, not because she needed to prove anything to anyone, but because her life had changed and her living situation needed to change with it. She still visited her sister and her nephews regularly. She still remembered where she came from, still understood what it felt like to be invisible, still carried that understanding into every consultation and every investigation. One day, while she was working in her office, she found herself thinking about that first morning, when she'd overheard Victoria speaking Russian in the master bedroom. She thought about how scared she'd been, how uncertain, how many times she'd almost decided to just keep quiet and pretend she hadn't heard anything. What if she had kept quiet? What if she'd been too afraid or too cautious to speak up? Richard would have lost everything. The fraud would have continued, and she would have spent the rest of her life wondering what would have happened if she'd just been a little bit braver. But she had spoken up. And in doing so, she'd not only saved one man's life, she'd also changed her own. She'd taken that moment of courage and built something from it. She'd turned her ability to observe and understand people into a profession. She'd become someone who helped others protect themselves. The penthouse where it had all started was no longer part of Richard's life. He'd sold it, wanting to move away from all the memories and associations. But Maria never forgot it. She never forgot walking through those rooms. Never forgot the feeling of discovering something that changed everything. Never forgot what it felt like to make a choice that mattered. That was the real story in the end. It wasn't about fraud or deception or international crime. It was about one person who noticed something was wrong and had the courage to do something about it. It was about how one act of honesty could ripple outward, changing lives, creating possibilities that nobody could have anticipated. It was about how the smallest person in a room, the invisible person that everyone overlooked, could be the one who made all the difference.